So while you guys are coming in, I'm just going to get started so we make sure that we start on time and end on time. My name's Nick Cavalancia. Subject today is detecting insider threats, and that it's all about behavior. Just a quick bit on me. I've been in IT for 25 years. Anybody that been in IT that long? I'm assuming there's some faces. Okay, my first server was a NetWare 2.2 server running on a 286 in non-dedicated mode.
You win.
Yeah, I do win. Yeah, pretty much. Something like that. Yeah. So I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've had a whole bunch of certifications over the course of my career. I make my living today as a technical evangelist. It means I write and I speak about technology. Basically, you all have your heads down doing very critical work every day, so you don't have time to look at the trends and what's going on in the industry. And so basically, there's this guy, that being me, who actually pays attention to that stuff, and then I get compensated typically by vendors or by media companies like Spiceworks and others to actually come and speak as sort of an industry analyst, if you will. So I make my living doing this every day. So let's start by talking about the state of the attack and just kind of what's going on in the industry today. A couple of stats. I'd like to use stats not because they're there to create FUD. I'm not a big fan of FUD, but when you use statistically relevant data, you actually have a really good sense of what's going on in the industry. So the first one is from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. And the percentage of data breaches is up to 31%. It was 24% last year. It's a 21% increase. So there's more insiders realizing that they can make money doing this. I think part of that is probably a lot of the sort of malware as a service kind of movement going on, where the average Joe criminal, if you will, realizes I can get my hands on really good state-of-the-art, malware and so on. And so the mind is kind of going, there are other ways that I can make money maliciously. That's kind of my sense of what's going on. So there's an increase in data breaches by insiders. That's too many. There we go. That's still too many. There we go. The average number of insider attacks on one organization is about 5. This comes from the Ponemon State of the Insider report. The numbers actually change based on the size of the organization. I apologize that the chart doesn't have along the bottom the actual number of employees. This is the way the chart was presented in the report. But if you look across, you basically can see as the number of employees grows, the more number of insider threats you're going to have on an annual basis. Just makes sense. People with 100 users. There's plenty of seats up front, all scattered around. Don't sit in the back. There's plenty all over the place. I can still see them. So come on in, look for one. Don't be shy. As the organization's bigger, you go from 100 seats to 100,000 seats. Obviously, there's a lot more people that potentially could be an insider. So that just makes perfect sense. Also from the same report, the average number of days to contain an insider threat, you see 73 days. That's not necessarily to remediate everything, just to contain it. You identified it, stopped it, and so on. I'll throw in another stat just to kind of stir up the pot a little bit that's not on the screen. And that's from the Carbon Black Global Threat Report that came out in January of this year. And that's 50% of all external attacks involve lateral movement. That means I'm moving from machine to machine to machine, which means that the bad guys look like the good guys. It would look like just a Joe user. So while you've got 73 days to contain an insider incident, I think according to Microsoft's advanced threat analytics, it's 146 days is the median number of days that an external attacker sits on your network unbeknownst to you until you finally detect them. So lots of time, lots of span there for people to be able to do bad things. In the case of just like a malicious insider, you're looking at 73 days. Then from Accenture's, what's the name of the report? I have to cheat. Cost of cybercrime report. There we go. 15% increase in the cost of malicious insider attacks from last year to this year. And then I put 2 different stats up here at the last part of what the actual average cost is over the course of a year. So if you were to divide by the 4.8, in theory, you'd get the average cost. Accenture says 1.6 million. The Ponemon report says 2.9 million. I don't care which number we use. We just know that it's a lot of money one way or the other. Even if you don't agree with those numbers going, my company's way too small, it's not, that's fine, right? So it's not 1.6 million. It's 100,000, it's 200,000, it's 50,000. It's still a lot of money we're talking about. It's more than one person's salary, and that's kind of the point that I wanted to make here. So it's not good, and I think it's just sort of getting worse. So then the kind of simple level setting conversation for a moment, the stuff that I think you already know, but we're going to talk about anyways, which is why is it so difficult? And the first and most important reason is it's just about intent, really. If you think about it, it's more like they're doing their job, but what's the intent? In some cases, I got up here, they're just doing the regular stuff. Sometimes it looks like it's out of the ordinary, like they're doing something that actually looks suspicious. That's the thing we always hear about when you read blog articles like, if someone's copying 1,000 files to a USB stick. I mean, yeah, it is, sure. It is suspicious, right? But the idea is most people aren't even doing just that. Sometimes it's far more innocuous, really, and they just might look like they're doing their job. I read a story a while back of a woman that was in a payroll department for a small construction firm in the northeast part of the U.S. and over a period of literally 8 years was writing herself fake paychecks. And then I don't know all the details, they didn't go into all of it in the story, but basically you read that, and she was going and cashing the checks. And the only reason she got caught was like after the 8th year is she went to a bank to, I don't know how she did this, but to cash the check in someone else's name, not her own name. I don't know how that works, but okay, I'm going to just go with it because I didn't, I was reading the story just like you guys are hearing the story. But the teller knew a person by that name and knew that that wasn't the person. And so red flag was raised. That's the only reason they got caught, right? So 8 years of writing payroll checks. 8 years of writing payroll. I'm going to say it again. 8 years of writing payroll checks to themselves. That's they're just doing their job. You don't know that they're doing anything bad. And then the reality here is because it's a nuance, really. Like I'm going to give an example in a couple slides where detecting a user's bad behavior, it's so slight. You go, that really looks suspicious. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. It's nothing more than like opening a window a couple of times in an application. You really have to be proactive in this. This is not something that once it's done, just like a data breach or something like that, the damage is done. Hopefully you try to stop it like you stop it on the first payroll check so that the 8 years of payroll checks don't happen. But you want to try to be as proactive as possible. So I'm going to talk about some of the leading indicators you can look at in order to detect this beforehand. For you guys in the back, there's still some chairs up here in the front, and I promise I will call on you. I'm just teasing. There's some over here as well, so if you guys don't want to stand up, you want to sit down, I still see seats. All right. What am I talking about on this slide? Identifying your potential risk is... Oh, that's right. Okay, I know what we're talking about. All right, here we go. So we have to decide where is the insider risk in the organization. Okay, so the first thing is that to consider that risk is always shifting. There are certain, we'll talk about roles and individuals and types of access and so on that you definitely go, I have to watch that person, sure. But the actual risk, who is the person that's going to put your organization in potential jeopardy financially or otherwise, it's constantly shifting. And there's a number of different reasons why that might come up. And what you'll notice here is in some cases, actually in most of these cases, you can't tell by technology any of these things. There's a concept called a fraud triangle that came out back in 73, if I remember correctly, 1973. And in the fraud triangle, there's basically 3 parts to committing fraud, but it also kind of applies to insider threats. And I always remember it was sort of the acronym of MORE, without the E, M-O-R. It's 3 parts. But it's in my mind, I was sort of associated as that insider, they want more. And this is the way you remember it. So the M is motivation. So they have some motivation. If you look up there, there's some motivation. Let's say that, like, for example, my wife, I don't mind sharing this with you, and she doesn't either. My wife has some heart issues and actually had 2 heart surgeries, and she's only 47. Okay, so the insurance covered everything, thankfully, but the bill was like over $225,000 for both surgeries. Now imagine if I didn't have good insurance, right? Financial hardship. So there's motivation. Oh, I got to figure out how I'm going to pay that thing. I got to pay that bill, and they're not calling me every day, and my credit's in the toilet, or whatever the case is, if that was the scenario, right? So I have to have motivation. The O in MORE, the M-O-R, no E, of course. The O is opportunity. So the woman who is the payroll person, she has the opportunity because she can cut payroll checks. Or someone that's in accounts payable can simply just change the banking details and route some money over there instead of over there where it's supposed to go, right? There's opportunity to do so. And then the R is rationalization. They're rationalizing it away. And so some good examples of here are things like personnel issues, like let's say a person that gets, someone gets passed over for a job promotion a couple times. That company owes me. I've worked here for 17 years and blah, 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 and I haven't gotten a raise. I mean, rationalize, right? So motivation, opportunity, rationalization. It's a fraud triangle, but it actually applies perfectly to insiders because all 3 of those things kind of come true. And that's why risk is shifting. So my wife's 2 heart surgeries within the last, 2.5 years? I guess about 2.5 years, the 2 surgeries she had. So 3 years ago, In my scenario where Nick doesn't have insurance, 3 years ago it wasn't a problem, right? But then suddenly my wife has to have surgery and I get this big bill. See, something changed and the risk shifts, and now I'm risky. See what I mean? So that's the point of why I say risk is constantly shifting. There's a survey by cybersecurity insiders. They do an annual insider threat report. This is from 2018. They haven't put out their 2019. It should actually be out, I think, next month. But they asked a bunch of IT leadership who they were worried about. And these were the top 3. Now, this doesn't mean these are the top 3 that are going to be insiders. It's just the top 3 that organizations are worried about. And what you notice is it's both regular employees and you guys. Because you're a risk too. I used to work for a software vendor that made insider threat detection software. And in a lot of cases, I could tell you about some very large organizations. I actually still won't say the names because I respect the fact that they don't want to be known, but where their own IT staff doesn't realize there are security teams that actually have the insider threat detection monitoring the IT security teams. So they have watchers watching the watchers. And then, of course, the question goes, well, who's watching those? I don't know. Now we're going on a rabbit hole. I don't want to do that. But you get the point. So they're actually watching even IT people. It's basically anybody has access to something important. So the first step here is you have to define risk levels in an organization. This is still going back to that idea of where is my risk, and so how do I do that? So we're going to define the risk levels. And I'm going to show you an example. It's just meant to be an example of how you might define risk levels. This is not the way to do it. This is just a way to do it. So kind of keep that in mind. By the way, I'm making all of this up as I go along. Does it sound like I know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. Just making sure. All right, double checking you guys are still awake. So you assign risk based on a couple of things, generally speaking. The first one is just the simple position and role. You look at what they have access to. So we already talked about payroll and accounts payable, and maybe it's the finance department, and maybe it's development because they have access to intellectual property. Or this woman over here was talking about she works in healthcare, and she's got doctors and nurses and contractors that have access to patient health information. And I mean, everybody and anybody is a risk, and so she's got a real pain. So it's based on role alone will give you some sense of it. Certainly department. Like you just say anybody in finance, done, right? That sort of thing. Some of the banking institutions, larger ones, they'll do it based off of departments where, like, let's say they got a set of, what do you call those? I guess not case managers, they're asset managers, something that own groups of customers that have like $2 million of worth and up or something like that. And so they look at that department. That whole department has to be monitored because it's really massive numbers of dollars in those accounts. And then just down to the individual. It might just be one-offs that have a particular access. They don't fit in a particular role or department or whatever the case is. So one of the ways you could do it as an example is you're going to assign them some kind of risk score. I'm going to use the example of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, 1 being the best. I don't know, the least worst, as the case would be. And normally I would have a very small piece of animation where if I click again, and I would have some of these numbers change just to kind of reemphasize that risk is shifting. The person that was a 5 is now a 10, and those things happen. And some of that you can detect through technology. Some of it's going to be purely offline in the real world. Now, the risk scores that you have, you're then going to try to group into some kind of meaningful categories of risk. I've got low, medium, and high. It doesn't have to be. It could be good and bad. It could be A through F. It doesn't matter. But the idea is you're going to group them together because those levels of risk you'll then group into, if I can get the clicker to go. Come on, clicker. 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 Did the battery die? Okay. Clicker. It didn't die. Then there we go. Then that's going to determine what kind of technology you're going to be putting in place to monitor, to detect, to prevent, all that kind of stuff. So you want to start by just coming up with the concept of, okay, we're going to define risk levels, we're going to group them, and then eventually we're going to assign technology to be watchful over those people based on their risk levels. All right, so here's an example of, this is a risk assessment that I did for a customer, and I'm going to kind of walk through the parts of this and then show you one filled out. It's just meant to be an example, and you'd have to apply this completely to your own environment. In fact, after having written this, probably a year or change ago, I look at it now and go, I really should be asking this question. I should be asking this. So it's not complete by any means, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you might put in play to figure out where your risk is in the organization. So I've got a set of objective questions, very specific things like, do they have access to? It's stuff that yes or no. Either they do or they don't. There's no way of interpreting it. And then you've got subjective questions, because there's also that part of it where you kind of got to go, well, I mean, is it really a risk to the organization? Are they? And you have to kind of feel those things. That's something that I want to add both into this, the way that you kind of figure out what risk score a particular individual or role or department may have. And then you'd have the answers, and then you'd assign a risk score. So some of the examples here for the objective questions. Do they have access to? And I've got check boxes there for like, personal data or healthcare data or credit card information or intellectual property. And you check those boxes as is appropriate or whatever and assign an answer and therefore a score. And I'll show you a score in a moment here. Do they have access to any of that stuff without supervision or accountability? And in my mind, that means that there are some kind of, there's auditing in the application perhaps. There's maybe checks and balances in terms of process that should be followed. They'd be caught from that perspective. Maybe there's already user activity monitoring or user behavior analytics already in play that's monitoring them from a technology standpoint. Some kind of accountability there. So the question there is, can they just freely they can go ahead and issue checks to whoever they want and no one would ever know? That sort of thing. And it's within a reason, right? Because eventually you've got to balance the budget or go through all the checks and make sure that everything looks right. But the next one here, can they perform any of the following without that same kind of accountability or supervision? So can they export? Can they print? I've even left off, can they copy it to a Google Drive or something like that, any kind of cloud-based storage? So it's, can they steal it, basically, is what's being asked. Again, without supervision or accountability. And then, do they work remotely? And that's sort of twofold. It's one, kind of adds to the whether or not the person has that kind of supervision or not, but also from the negligence standpoint of they're working in a Starbucks and they have no sense of, on their personal laptop and no firewall and someone hacks into it or that kind of thing as well, right? Because it still elevates risk for the organization. And then I've got here that they require the signing of documents having a non-compete or a non-solicitation. That's more of giving you some context, some color around if they had to sign a non-compete before they got here, then when you get to the subjective questions, which are things like if they leave the organization and took stuff with them, how much harm would that be? This is a real good indicator that if you have a non-compete or a non-solicitation, they have access to some stuff that probably could hurt the organization when they leave. So then some of the subjective questions here, if they went to competitors with data, if they had their laptop stolen, again, back to the negligence, if they sold the data they access, and or if they decided just to purely they want to harm the company. They feel like they're due. And in fact, there was what was the story about a month and a half ago? Someone wrote some Excel macro code or something or other to modify a whole bunch of data after they left. Did you guys read about that? Yeah? Was it Excel macro code? Okay, so he broke. That's what it is. He broke it, so he'd have to fix it later on. Told you need me. Yeah, rationalization. So anyway, so then this is an example here. I've got an accounts receivable clerk up at the top, and I've filled in all the values. So for those of you taking pictures, this is the time to take the picture because now everything's filled in. And you'll notice that, for example, I'm put in there they have some credit card data, they have some vendor lists, and I assigned a score. Now, is that the absolute right score? I don't know. In some ways, this doesn't even matter. It's more of an exercise so that you get a sense of how you might approach this. Again, 1 to 10, not necessarily the way to do it. You might do A through F, good and bad, high, medium, low. It's up to you entirely. And then the other thing that you actually find when you do this exercise is let's say you just did this exact way, 1 through 10. And you come up with this positional score here at the bottom of a 4. And then you do the next roll. And when you do the next roll, you end up with let's say a 6, and you're going, but wait a second, they're not even as risky a position as an accounts receivable clerk. And then you realize, maybe the way that I'm doing this whole thing is kind of off. And really in your own organization, you end up finding that you have to kind of work through the process and modify it as you're doing the process because it's not just going to be cut and dry. It works perfectly the first time. There's sort of this subjectivity that you won't know until you get into the sort of the thick of it. All right, so I got plenty of time. We're good. So now I take these risk scores at the end, and I talked about we got to assign them some kind of generic levels so we can assign technology to them. So just to give you some examples, this isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but just gives you an idea of some of the technology you might use. So for low, you might have something like user behavior analytics, and just to define that for anybody who goes, not exactly sure what that is, that's a software solution that is monitoring the user to see shifts in behavior, and in often cases, shifts in communication, and I'll talk about both of those in another slide. It's very high level. It's not necessarily doing like the watching and the session recording and keystrokes and not all that stuff. That's actually the next click, user activity monitoring in a minute. But this is more at a high level. Does it appear like they might be crossing some thresholds? They've made some changes in the way that they behave, and if so, maybe we needed to advance the monitoring of that person to something a little more detailed. So this is for leading indicators more than anything. Then I've got also, you might have a SIM solution in play, because you could still use that for looking at, let's say, something like if I just have a lot of traffic coming from that person's endpoint, right? And you've got a traffic monitoring solution or IDS or something that's feeding into a SIM solution, and you can see, or a SIM solution can tell you if you're taking logs data from, let's say, logons. They're logging on Saturday at 3 p.m. That's kind of weird, you know what I mean? So that would be a leading indicator. So for the low, you're still watching because you're kind of going, I still don't trust you. I wrote a book last year on next-gen access and zero trust security. And I'm a real big believer in that for most organizations, where usually you hear of things like never trust, trust but verify is the old Russian proverb, I think, right? Zero trust is never trust, always verify. And so I kind of like that position, because I think we're getting there with the attacks that are happening, the prevalence, the frequency, the fact that, like back to that stat I mentioned earlier, half the attacks always use lateral movement. You can't believe anything at this point. You have to just assume that it's not you, and you have to double check everything. So I would definitely use multiple solutions, even for the low-level people, because again, risk shifts, and suddenly if they have access to something, you want to be at least proactive and be watchful. For medium level and above, you'd have user activity monitoring, and again, to level set, UAM would be, in my mind, would be a keylogger on steroids. So every keystroke, every application, every email, every chat, every window you open, every file you touch, everything you print, everything. I mean, Big Brother, video camera over your shoulder. I mean, session recording inside the computer, but someone standing over your shoulder with a video camera watching everything you do and be able to play it back. And then because those people that are higher levels of risk, I want to know everything you did, not just the thing that that I'd be concerned about that looks malicious, but I want to know before, during, and after the event in question, because I need context. The example I like to use is, let's go back to the ever-present, someone copies a bunch of files to a USB stick. Was that good or bad? And the answer is we don't know, right? So, but if I could rewind the clock a little bit, and I could see that user received an email from their boss that said, hey, I'm going to go to this meeting up in New York City, and I need a copy of all the such and such files on a USB stick. Would you do that for me, please? Now you got context. Okay, it's fine. Now maybe the boss is, committing something bad. I don't know, right? But the person doing the unwitting participant. There's actually a really good story from when I worked at one of the insider threat detection companies. And it was a huge, I don't remember the name of the company, it was a huge global conglomerate, and they had someone who started a job in Japan. And in their first week, I don't know how this happened, but in their first week, they got an email from someone pretending to be their sort of equivalent in the San Francisco office, and said, I'm actually out of the office and I've lost my phone. I'm even emailing you from my personal email address. They actually looked up, I think, on LinkedIn and found the person's name, and they mimicked an email address and spoofed it and that kind of thing, and said, I don't have a copy of the global address list. Could you send me, I don't know, a copy or print screens or something with all the global address list? And so that person wanted to be helpful because they're brand new and it's my peer at someplace else. And so what do? They sent it to them, and then that got flagged, and it turned out they were just the unwitting participant. But again, needed that context to realize, now they got duped. They aren't actually doing anything malicious. They just were trying to be helpful. So that helps. But at the same time, back to the USB stick and the bunch of files, if you roll the clock back forward and you look on their, let's say, their chat or something, or they're on Google Hangouts or something with text messaging with somebody, and you see I got the goods, you bring the bag, meet you at 6 o'clock behind the building. Then yeah, it's bad, right? So you need that context. And so that's where UAM comes in play, because now I can look before, during, and after the event in question, because that same message might have happen after the copying of the file. So, so we want to have that. And then do I have anything for this? Oh, and then real-time alerting. This is probably more of an extension of UAM and UBA, but just having alerts with anything happens that seems suspicious. You want to be notified right away, and that's usually built-in functionality. The introduction of UAM is giving us the ability to review if we want to. If we think that someone's, for example, I'm going to go through, if someone's leaving the organization, you might want to go back 30 days and figure out what they've been doing the last 30 days. We just want to do a quick review, see if anything looks odd. But if it's high, you want to be real-time alerted anytime something happens. All right. So behavioral indicators. Good, I'm drawing on time. I've got two of them. Well, I have more than two. I have two types, I should say. So you've got leading indicators and you've got active threat indicators, both kinds. And so the list is not all that lengthy, but kind of I want to go walk through all these. And the leading indicators, I mentioned earlier, shifts in behavior, shifts in communication. So shifts in behavior would be things like they're coming in, like I mentioned, at odd times of the day, that they're starting to look for jobs. They're going to different websites. There's even an entire line of thinking of people potentially going on the dark web, trying to find a way to make money off of what they have access to. There's some documented cases, and there's even some solicitation cases that exist on the dark web where people say, do you have access to, and we'll pay you for the access and that kind of thing. So it does happen. It's not that big of a concern, but it does happen. And then what else was I going to say for shifts of behavior? I think I'll leave that alone. So then the shifts in communication are interesting because there are psycholinguistic indicators that can be used to determine that somebody, their mindset is changing. Remember I talked about it's all about intent, right? And there's that rationalization, which is all up in your head. I deserve this. There's a kind of thinking that goes along there. And so the psycholinguistic indicators look for things like shifting from generally positive about the company to generally negative. Can't believe they passed me up for that job. I deserve that job, that kind of stuff. But then also generally going from lots of we's and us's. Hey, we're going to be going to exhibit at Spiceworks next week, and we're going to have a great time, and we're expecting to get 30 leads or whatever it is, right? That's me in the kind of marketing. I'm using that example. It shifts to I's and me's. You just heard it before. I can't believe they passed me up for that job, right? So when there's those kinds of changes, then you know that you may have a potential issue going on. And it's kind of interesting because it goes back to, you think of like Captain America Civil War. Not Civil War? No. Yeah, was it Civil War? Was that? No, before. What was the one before that? What's that? Winter Soldier, where they had basically they targeted everybody based on their data, and like this guy is more likely to commit that Minority Report and that kind of thing. We're kind of there, not in the spooky way, but in the way of like there are at least really clear indicators. I mean, even years ago, before UBA was even a thing, roll the clock back, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years. The FBI even had lists of words that if you were to put those into like watching emails and chat messages, they were indicators. I mean, a lot of work has been done to figure this out. Then over on the, let's see, what else do I want to put? The other thing I want to point out here is if you look at most of these, they're not technology related, like HR issues. That's HR just saying, I've had 3 complaints about that employee, and that's in a system somewhere, but that's not the same thing as monitoring the user's behavior for something bad. That's something that's completely offline, or at least in a totally different environment. You have to try and somehow correlate the data. Looking for a new job, that's certainly in technology because they're going to Monster.com or Glassdoor or wherever it is they're going. But personal changes, my wife having heart surgery, that's not anywhere unless I'm emailing somebody at work or whatever, that kind of thing. But even then, it'd be kind of hard to pick that one up. Over on the right side, active indicators. Now, this is in my mind is someone who's actively doing something threatening to the organization. And you look down the list here, and you'll see things like log-on times, like I mentioned, Saturday at 3 p.m. You've got abnormal application use. This is a great example. This is actually something that happened. So a customer was alerted to a potential insider threat, and it was still potential, but it was through an active indicator. And this was the active indicator. It was somebody it was either like payroll or accounts payable, someone issuing checks, whatever position that can cut checks inside of a system. But they couldn't really muster the courage up to do it. So they opened the window to cut the check and closed it, and then opened it and then closed it, and then they opened it, and it was 6, 7, 8 times in a very small window of time. That's unusual. You shouldn't be doing that. Right? So that's that kind of thing where sometimes, that's what I was talking about. There's just small nuance that comes into play where that's what they use to detect there's something going on with this person. Nothing more than they open the window, 7 times in a minute and a half or whatever. Yeah, I'm making up numbers, but you get the point. Things like excessive printing and copying files and, the usual stuff that you guys already know. Let's see, what else here? Unusual communications would be abnormal domains that they'd be talking to. Again, looking for specific words. And usually in a lot of UAM solutions, user activity monitoring solutions, they can both look for abnormal activity at a larger level, just using that dumb example again of like printing 50 copies of something or other. But they can also do it at more like keyword level of this particular Project Aurora. If that comes up, we want to be notified if anybody's doing anything in email about Project Aurora because no one's supposed to. Those kinds of correlations of the data. So there's ways to look for active indicators. All right. Good. I have till 11:30, right? Okay. Good. I have to do some Q&A, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so to build an insider threat program, I got 5 steps. I'm focusing mostly on 2 through 5. One real quick, understanding your obstacles. I think I left a slide out, so I'm just going to kind of verbally talk to it. The obstacles are generally speaking getting support from both the executives, from finance, from security, from legal. I mean, there's a lot of people that come into play here. But you get that. You got to worry about budget. You have to worry about privacy. Because there's a lot of, anybody from Germany or France, you have privacy laws. Again, no one here, then we can talk about those people. Anyway, so I'm teasing. I'm not going to do that. But in Germany, they have a lot of privacy laws where some of the solutions that do this monitoring, in order to get permission to do it, like I remember an organization has to have the CEO and the head of the labor union both have to agree. And then what they did was they built in kind of a dual missile key kind of solution where they came up with a very long password to enable it, and half the password is owned by the CEO and half the password is owned by the labor union person. And then that way, the 2 missile keys have to be turned, and then they can start monitoring. That kind of thing. So there's some privacy laws here in the U.S. in general. And I'm not a lawyer; don't play one on TV. So seek your own legal counsel, blah blah blah, right? But in general. In the workplace, they have no reasonable expectation of privacy. However, you'll see I'm going to put some things up here that at least make sure that you are communicating to somebody you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in the workplace. Right? At least then you've said, hey, fair warning. Right? We did our part, and that helps the company be legally protected. All right, so when you're building an insider threat program, there are a number of levels of maturity. You can see here going from non-existent, reactive, proactive, predictive, and optimized. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, there's a bit.ly URL that I put. I wrote with a software vendor, Veriato, I wrote an insider threat maturity model report that both kind of defines what each of those levels are, and goes in real nice specific detail of like what kind of communication would you have at a reactive level, and you used to look through that, and then it has a whole set of survey data to show you where people are. For example, I don't think I have it in this deck, but for these 5, it's more or less a bell curve, not entirely surprisingly, where most people are right in the middle and proactive, and I'll cover each of these in a second. But I would definitely recommend you take a look at that report. It's a real good piece of data. So in non-existent, they basically don't have a program, and they don't even know where there's insider threats. So that's none of you because you're here at least. You at least know that you have insider threats, and that's why you bothered to show up. But there are companies like, I didn't know people could do that. Yeah, of course they can. But anyways, reactive here, there's no program in place, but they're certainly aware, and they'll react as is necessary. So something happens, we'll do something about it. But we're not going to go spend money or have a formal program or buy specific software. We'll, just purely, it's reactive in its most, base sense. Then proactive here is they've got technology, they've got good communication, there's some kind of program, if you will, in place that's there. You've got solutions in place that are there to spot an insider before they do something, so you're trying to be as proactive as you can. And then you've got predictive, and this is where it really gets formal. Most people are still at proactive. I have a software solution in place. That's the program, basically. That is the whole insider threat program for the organization. But predictive is where you start actually getting real formalized. You have an entire team. You have somebody who's actually in charge of that team. You have budget dedicated to it, that whole thing. And you can see here there's program definitions and policies and processes and that kind of thing. And then the last one, optimized here, this is where they're just dynamically changing, and they've figured out ways to, like, for example, keep reassessing risk based on role and individual and department and that kind of thing, and then modifying as is necessary. So 5 different levels of maturity. Now, you have to start with what you even consider an insider threat. For some organizations, you're just thinking, well, people steal data. Okay, is there a certain amount, or is there a certain type? Or do you care if, what about negligent insiders? Is that an insider threat? How about somebody just who's got somebody that in your organization like wastes, I don't know, half their time or a quarter of their time just watching cat videos on the internet or whatever? Okay, so right, okay, good. Okay, is that an insider threat? I mean, it is, right? Technically it is, but is that from a program definition standpoint, do you care about watching for that? Which, by the way, you can totally catch them with user activity monitoring solutions. That's easy. But you got to figure out what you consider an insider threat. You got to figure out what assets are of value, same kind of thing. What do you care if they steal or not? Woman over here in the healthcare I mentioned earlier, she's worried about they're stealing PHI like crazy. It's going out the door. They're sending out to Gmail and all kinds of stuff, right? So there's real problems. You've got to define what kind of assets you care about. And then what are the goals of the program? And I think I've got a couple of them here. Yeah. So some organizations may not want to worry about potential threats. They're not worried about, we're not going to do all this minority report crap. We're just going to, we're going to watch for real things that we think are bad. We'll look for keywords. And if we see them doing it, we're going to stop it. Okay. That's fine. At least define that. You have to know what it is you're trying to get to. You got to figure out whether you want to detect insider threats. You just want to respond to them. Do you want to figure out inadvertent breaches? Because that happens too. You hear of lots of stories. You guys have all read them, of something like there was a database that was accidentally exposed to the internet, and but someone made an ACL change somewhere, or they did something to expose it, right? They copied it under the wrong spot. I don't know, whatever it is. So you could be detecting that. That might be because it is an insider threat to the organization, even though it's not entirely malicious, or maybe it's not malicious at all, but it's still a threat. And then, of course, spotting the malicious activity. So you got to figure out what are your goals. And you might have other goals, even than what's there, but that just gives you an idea of there are a couple of different things. See people taking pictures, so I'll wait. Which is just code for excuse to take a drink of water. Oh, I forgot one. And enhance your investigative abilities. How many people have like forensic software, like forensic software? Anybody? Nobody uses forensic software anymore. Okay, it's kind of good actually, as long as you have something proactive in place. Because I used to sort of argue with forensics people, but I'm like, but you're going back looking for artifacts that may or may not be there, as opposed to you could just be recording them with basically the equivalent of, a digital, like a DVR, watching everything they do proactively, and you can just play it all back. That makes a lot more sense to me. But okay, but it helps enhance the investigative abilities of this kind of program because you'd put solutions in place that will allow you to do that. All right, so the team that's necessary, the key stakeholders are going to be, first off, obviously need senior management buy-in. That's going to be critical. I think we all kind of know that. You're going to have to talk about this in terms of the business and not about technology. It's not about stopping insiders. It's about reducing the risk to the organization of data breach, because they've already heard data breach, and they know how much that costs. What is it, $144 a record or something on the average, if I remember correctly from Ponymon's report. Maybe it's a little more this year, and in healthcare it's like $314 a record. It's ridiculously high. Human resources, because you need to involve them. You're going to see there's going to be a lot of communication with HR that gets involved, because you're going to want to make sure that you are also aware, using them as a source, an offline source of intel. They might even come to a security team, whoever the head of this team is, and say, "Hey, Joe. I've talked to Joe. We've got a big problem. He just told me about all these things, and he's now having financial issues at home and whatever, and he really wants to get a raise. And we should probably watch him." Right? That's a good piece of intel. You're not going to get through any piece of software. Legal. They want to be involved because of a number of issues. You're going to be watching people. You're going to be responding. You're going to be making accusations. There's going to be, I'm going to show you on another slide here, a number of pieces of paper that are legal documents. You're going to be asking people to sign. You're going to be reminding them of them. Legal's definitely involved in this process. You guys, duh, right? And then if you have a separate security team, they're going to be involved as well because this is definitely going to be something in their wheelhouse. They may actually be the ones that are doing reviews. In some organizations, the IT team is the one implementing the software that gets used, but the security teams are actually the ones doing the work of, let's say, doing reviews of activity or being notified and so on. In a more mature, like probably predictive and forward, they usually have a senior official that's just basically someone's designated as you're in charge. Normally, somebody's in charge, but this is actually an official title that's the person who's ahead of the entire program, and they usually report to the board, that kind of thing. That's for larger organizations in more mature models. What do I do now? Okay, essential elements. You already know you have to have buy-in. We've covered that. There'll be communication between departments. You're going to need to be, like I said, HR, legal, the different departments that you're even just dealing with and talking to those different department heads. There's going to be a lot of interdepartmental communication that will exist when this is implemented. If you're doing this, you'll see in some of the scenarios that I've got at the end how there is talking between departments involved in a process here. And that's what's going to be the basis for this sort of mitigation framework, or it might be remediation or just response, depending on what you're actually planning on doing here. You have to have visibility into your employees' behavior, one way or the other. I've seen SIM solutions that say they're user activity monitoring. I kind of go, kinda. I mean, because there has to be an audit trail that can report into a SIM solution that then can say, I know what they're doing. I mean, you can look at network traffic. You can look at where they're going on the web. You can look at file access. I mean, there's some things you definitely can do, but you're not getting a comprehensive view. You need probably something that's more agent-based on the endpoint, or perhaps session recording if it's something that's remote. You'll see like privileged session monitoring solutions that will give privileged access to a server, but they have their own proxy, and therefore they record all the activity and collect metadata. So at least you have to see something into what the employees are doing. And then, so computer and HR, I think I've belabored the point. I'm going to skip that. So just, if you guys are taking pictures, I saw some phones up, sorry. You have to have a computer. You have to have basically online and offline sources for the success of this program. Actually, I can talk about this. Also, the other thing for employee behavior, key cards, security cameras, phone logs, anything that has nothing really to do with being on their computer. That could go in the sort of the visibility and employee behavior as well. Just seeing that they logged in. I mean, I caught an employee once that said they got there at 8 o'clock, and she consistently wasn't there at 8 o'clock, and so we started looking at her door logs, and she would come in at 8:40. So that it's the employee behavior still, just not inside the computer. So I will mention that. All right, so critical documentation that you're going to need as you're building the insider threat program. Some organizations do background and credit checks. Again, trying to reduce the risk. Do they have bad credit? Depends on the position and that sort of thing, which you're trying to figure out, are they a risk in general? If they have really bad credit and they're coming in as your VP of Finance, I mean, kind of asking for it, just saying, right? All right, so, he's a 400. Yeah, so CIPA, Confidential and Intellectual Property Agreement, you should definitely have one of these. You should make every employee sign it. And this basically says the computer's ours, the data on the computer's ours. There's nothing on that you should misconstrue as being yours, because you're going to use this later on. If they, let's say, I'm going to show you an example of an employee leaving, and when they leave, you're going to go, remember this thing you signed? Yeah, that. Remember that. You're leaving. It's fine. Sorry to see you go. Not really. But, remember this document. You can't take anything with you. Got to destroy it before you go. Digital copies have to be destroyed. I mean, that's what CIPAs are all about. An acceptable use policy. This is usually where you're telling people that you have no expectation of privacy here. We have the right. Usually organizations don't say, we are monitoring you, because in essence, there's always that question of like, do you tell people you are or do you not? And generally speaking, my viewpoint is you don't, because you want to catch them in their natural behavior. I mean, a really good example, this is a real story that I'd read. This is at least 10 or probably 10 years ago. I live in Fort Lauderdale in Florida. Right, we're somewhere else, right? We're in Texas. I can't remember. I traveled somewhere else. I was in Denver last week. I'm everywhere. And so I can't remember where I am. So down in Miami, just south from me, is University of Miami School of Medicine and the Jackson Memorial Hospital. And there was a story in the news about a contractor that was stealing PHI, and basically they're trying to steal the Social Security numbers of the people and their details. And what they were doing, they were just using their phone and they're taking pictures of every screen. Now, obviously, not the most efficient way, right? Because we're like, how are you going to export that out? Well, you can use OCR, and well, like our heads are all turning, like how you might do that. But this is just somebody who's like, I'm just going to take pictures of 100 people, and then I'm going to sell it to somebody, and I don't care what they do with it. That's up to them. They can keystroke it in for all I care. And the way they got caught was when they went down to the garage. I guess someone saw them doing some weird transaction, and they got caught down in the garage. But they were just taking pictures on their phone. Well, they would have definitely gotten away with that from a standpoint of you watching them, because you're not watching them doing that, right? So instead, I'd rather at least they try to do print screens. Perfect. Yes, do lots of those because we can detect print screens, or whatever. At least now you know, right? That's better than not knowing. So either way, they're going to do it. So an acceptable use policy is there. And usually I always say, I wouldn't tell them that you're doing it, but with an acceptable use policy, I would say we have the right to monitor you, retain the right. We, again, talk to legal counsel, your mileage may vary, whatever, but make sure you get the right verbiage. But something that says basically, we're monitoring, but we're not going to tell you we're monitoring. So you should probably think that we're monitoring. That way you know. The Security Acknowledgement Agreement, it's again, same kind of thing. Some organizations go this far to have a separate document that does that, but it just depends. Some people put it in the UAP. Even going as far as log-on banners. There was a court case 5-6 years ago or something, and one of the argument was basically they did this once, like when I started, 5 years ago or whatever, and I haven't heard. How would I remember that? And so it's sort of a legal thing from a legal standpoint, putting on the logon banner, although none of us use logon banners pretty much these days anymore, but or I haven't seen them in a long time, is to put something up that kind of reaffirms you are now logging on to the such and such corporate network. Anything that you do can be monitored by the organization, blah, 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 blah. So it's reaffirming over and over and over again that you're now entering our territory and we own it. Yep. Okay, yeah, you should. Yeah, every day, yes. All right, so intelligence sources. I'm going to run out of time here in a minute here. Actually, I'm going to just put these up here and walk through here we go. So online, user behavior analytics, user activity monitoring. Offline, physical security, like the cameras, the video surveillance, the badge scans, that kind of thing. And then HR. Again, you want to use them as a source of intel. There are changes, even just something like that idea of, I said, I can't believe they passed me up for the job. Put that in an HR perspective. HR comes to you and says, okay, Bob got passed up for a job. It's the second time in a year. That might be an issue. You might want to be looking at Bob to see what's going on. There could be some real rationalization going on there, so that's a really good piece of intel. All right, from the IT Maturity Model Report, I grabbed this screenshot. If you look over at the right, you see the kinds of different solutions being used. The one that's the largest, which is a gray bar, if you happen to be colorblind, I mean that sincerely, it's the one that's longest in almost every single chart. That's user activity monitoring. The second largest one, that's pink, again, that's second largest up at the top three anyways. That's just log data, more or less using SIM. And then the yellow there, which is maybe kind of a good third or almost second tied there, is email archives and e-discovery. So there's a lot of different kinds of solutions, and you notice in there we still have forensics tools, we have UBA, we have phone and record data. So lots of different kinds of solutions being used by organizations depending on their maturity model, which is what the left-hand side of the axis is for. All right. So building incident response plans. You should make them scenario-based. Try and figure out some either leading indicators type of scenarios. What should we do if we actually think, like Bob got passed up twice? What do we do? Do we do anything? Do we do nothing? What is the protocol here? Should someone review their logs? Do we start monitoring them for malicious activity, or we just leave it with user behavior analytics, or what do we do? I don't know. We have to figure that out. Same thing with active indicators. What do we do? And I'm going to give an example here of an employee being terminated here. And this is just a quick response plan. You can see the task in the first column, who's responsible to do it, who needs to be notified, and the what I call just the SLA, for lack of a better term, but the response time, if you will. And just to walk through this. So prior to them being involuntarily terminated, I like that term. It sounds so pleasing, doesn't it? All right, so the manager's got to notify HR. Hey, I'm going to fire this person. So then HR is going to notify IT the same exact moment. Like, okay, this person's getting terminated. Security's got to be notified as well. I think I left that off that particular one. They've got to do a plus minus 30-day activity review. I say plus minus 30, meaning The day that we know that they're going to be terminated, they might not be terminated until Friday. But the moment we know, security's got to go back and look the last 30 days because there's a reason why they're being fired. And maybe we need to either have some detail of what they were doing or not doing, like you weren't doing any work the last 30 days to back up the need to fire them or whatever the case is, or to see if anything malicious is going on. And then the plus 30-day, meaning if we're not firing them for another 2 days or something, we're going to watch everything they're doing because, I don't know, if you've ever been fired, I've been fired once in my career, but at some point before you actually were fired, you knew you were getting fired. Right? I mean, you know, it might have been 5 minutes. It might have been 5 days, but you knew you were getting fired. So you do that review, and then you see here security's got to notify legal and HR. And if you see, I'm going across departments, back to that interdepartmental communication. I'm going cross department all the time here. Then the day that we're actually going to fire them, you see the employee is going to be notified of termination. We're going to actually have them review the SEPA. Again, remember this document that says it's not yours, you don't own it, you have to destroy it. Yep, okay, we are legally expecting that you're going to hold to that. It's more of just like a threatening kind of meeting real quick. Then you see terminating their access, return of company property. You get a signed certificate of return and destruction, not a restruction. What would it even be? Anyways, a return and destruction. And that's just to make sure that they are saying they actually did. And you should have all these documents. Why legal, again, is involved quite a bit. So I think that is it. Yeah, that's it. And I'm sort of right on time, right? Simone, am I right on time? Okay, so we're good. So if you have any questions, I'll take those. Also, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, open up your LinkedIn app. Up to the right of the search bar is the little 4 boxes. You press that, it'll open up your camera. You can take a picture, and it'll put you right on my LinkedIn profile. And I will be happy to connect with you. So questions, go ahead.
I have 2 of them. The first one is you covered involuntary terminations. But shouldn't some of that also be done for voluntary?
Oh, absolutely. The question is, should you also be doing that for voluntary terminations? And the answer is absolutely yes, because just because someone says I'm leaving, well, I might be leaving because I stole everything I needed to steal, and I found someone who's going to pay for it. I mean, right? So, yeah. So that was just one example. So, yeah, what was your second question?
The second question was there's a number of AI-based tools for employee monitoring. Do you have any experience with those? How good are they?
It depends on the algorithms. Yes, I mean it's necessary, but what I find I can think of one solution. I don't like mentioning vendor names, so I'll try to keep that out. But they have user behavior activity that uses AI in order to detect it, and you have to set thresholds, and they try to make it super easy, where it's basically if you're seeing too many red flags, you notch down the threshold, but they try to make it as simple as they can. But you're going to need to do that because you have to correlate a lot of different data. It has to be the psycholinguistic indicators along with some of the behavior, along with, let's say, logon times, along with, a wide range of stuff. So I think in a lot of ways it's going to be necessary in order to be able to keep up with that. I saw a question over here somewhere. Yeah, please?
So doing this improperly can be very toxic in an environment. You know, your employees lose morale, Big Brother's watching you.
Yep.
It's not a great place to be. How do you decide when it's appropriate to put this in? Is there a minimum size of a firm? Is there any details like that?
I think now, well, let me address what I have seen with organizations that have put solutions in place is, one, they generally don't tell anybody because of exactly that reason. HR is the one that's always going. That's why you get HR's buy-in at the beginning. That's one of the key stakeholders because they're going, this is going to ruin morale. I mean, and they're not wrong. You've experienced it, I'm guessing. So normally you don't tell people that it's there, and even when you're firing somebody, you're not telling them that you have the detail. That's what most organizations sort of do. They just leave that out because they don't want to ruin morale. So, but back to your real question, which is how do you put this in and when do you put this in? Most organizations are doing this purely based off of risk, not off the size of the organization. It's really how much would you lose. It's kind of like maybe start with those subjective questions that were in the risk assessment, but just thinking about it from an organizational standpoint. What do we have to lose, and do we have enough that it makes sense we need to be watching what people do? I know that's not you want the answer of 50 people, and if you're making more than $2 million, but it doesn't really work that way. So I hope that helps. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Inside our ERP, if we turn on verbose monitoring, it just drags the system down pretty bad. Do you have suggestions or solutions in that regard?
Well, you might be using the wrong solution. You might be using something that's really more focused on looking at behavior of users specifically. And I mean, that's yeah, I'd probably go that route. I would say I would look at a solution that is really focused on truly looking at just insider threats more than anything. and then go that route, because otherwise you're trying to find it amidst all kinds of other normal activity. That we just want to look for threatening activity, and that's the best answer I can come up with. But I know what you're saying. You're getting, it's a storm of data that you don't need to be seeing. That's irrelevant or lots of red flags, and so that's why. Even good SIM solutions have all kinds of insider threat specific rules put in place, and even some AI to try and detect it. So I think trying to find something that at least is been designed, or if there's a plugin for your ERP solution that's just about insider threat. Something that gets you closer so you can filter out the crap you don't. That's the best answer I can give you, and I apologize. I wish I had something better. But you had a question here, please.
Oh, a lot of the recent big breaches haven't necessarily been insiders. It's been vendors and contractors. Can you apply the same kind of principles dealing with somebody who's insider, not insider?
It's a challenge. So some of the ways that it's been done would be mandate that when contractors want to access the environment, they're doing so through like a remote desktop. So they go into a Citrix box or something or other, right? And they're doing it there, and then that becomes your environment that you control with your logon banner again, right? You made them sign some of the same agreements, and then you're monitoring everything they do. So it's the simple answer, but that's the best way possible. The same problem is with like supply chains, right? You've got how many different sets of contractors, and I wrote a white paper on that very topic, and it was it's a real challenge to do it, and the only real good answer is I have to get all those people into my environment, and because you can't mandate, hey, your personal laptop, put this software so we can watch what you're doing at home on your own time. That doesn't work. So it's really thinking about building an infrastructure of it's DAS or VMs in the cloud or whatever, but something where they're accessing your environment and they work within your environment. That's the best answer. Other questions? No? You sure? Going once? Going twice? That's fine. Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate you guys being here.